This presentation is about an evidence-based instructional technique called explicit instruction, which is often also called direct instruction. This is where we start to talk about how you teach your students. This technique is good for basically any skill, any knowledge base that you want to teach your students. I know as a teacher, I went through the interview process, both online applications and in-person interviews before I got my first teaching job. And one of the most common questions I got asked me to list, 2 or 3 of the instructional techniques that I'll use. And by far the most common response that they're looking for is direct instruction or explicit instruction. Just because it is an evidence-based technique, it's clearly structured, it's very systematic, and it just shows that you know how to reach your students. So I hope that you'll really pay attention to this particular lecture and start to think about how you can embed this into your own teaching. Some of you are going on to student teaching soon, but many of you will be in methods next year and you will be asked to teach students. So hopefully this becomes a part of your repertoire. The first thing that I'm going to ask you to do is take a look at 2 different videos in your guided notes that you may or may not have with you. These questions are there for you to take notes on. So as you watch each video, I want you to just jot down some of the techniques that you see in each video. Things like built-in repetition, positive reinforcement, immediate feedback, continuous assessment, just some basic educational techniques that you should be somewhat familiar with at this point. And then after the video, just go ahead and pause it and write down some of the pros and cons of that particular strategy. After the second video, I ask that you consider which classroom you would learn best in and which classroom you feel would be the best fit for all types of learners.
$120 of this concentrated. When you add it all up, I got 1,200 cups concentrated and 2,400 cups cold water.
What did you add all up?
Well, after I got the concentrated, for example, after I got each answers to those,
Okay, back up a second. What do you mean by each answer to those? What does that mean?
Like 240 plus 120 plus 480 plus 360.
Okay, so you're thinking each one cup should be 240 total cups?
No, I mean like each one cup would equal
120 cups?
And then you multiply that one.
Why is that? Why do you think each cup should be 120?
Because if there's 240 campers and they all get halves, then that would make their 120 regular cups if you fill them up.
Okay. Okay.
And then I would multiply them times how many people there were. I mean, how many cups demonstrated you need.
But if all you need is 240 cups total, 120 cups, like you said, you want 120 cups of juice, is that what you're saying? For 240 campers.
Full cups, yeah.
Okay, so you need 120 full cups. But you're making this recipe. You're not making all 4 recipes. You're making 1 recipe at a time.
But I mean, they asked, like, it said that each campus was yet for each recipe.
But you're not making all 4 recipes to serve at one time. Monday, you're going to make this one. Tuesday, this one. Wednesday, Thursday. Friday, you pick the best one. So each day, you're making a different recipe.
So I should put, like, for max A, it would be 240 cups concentrate and 360 cups of cold water. Because that's 120 cups of concentrate there. Times 2 of them.
How many times are you going to serve this juice? You have 240 cups here, 360 cups here. You're going to have a lot of juice, aren't you? Downside. You want to make a total of 120 cups of juice using this recipe. I'll show you. You know what I'm saying?
But
what you can do with it to make 120. Use the same idea. You got a really good idea going on. You really do.
I made it specific too because if it's 10 cups would equal one recipe of 2 and 3. And then if there's 10 times 12.
But 10 cups don't make one recipe.
So it isn't? Okay.
What makes one recipe?
5 cups.
Okay, see what you have confused is the recipe and how many people that will serve.
Oh. So it shouldn't be the 10.
You got all these good things going on, but you have used the wrong number to manipulate it.
It's not 10, it's 5. 60.
What do you notice about 60?
60 is 1/5, means 3/5 out of 100, and it's 3/6 out of 120.
What do you know about 3/6?
That's
Well, you know 3/6. 3/6 is what other fraction? Make it really simple.
1/2.
Uh-huh. So you've got 24 and 36, which makes 60.
So
you need how much juice do you need? Altogether, how much juice do you need?
120.
You got 60.
So 40. So let's see if 5 can go all the way up to 120. Maybe.
See. You're on the right track.
There's.
Alright, so that's video number 1. You can go ahead and pause and write down what you believe are some of the pros and cons. This is video number 2. This is a very different subject and different grade levels, but you can hopefully identify the difference in the instructional technique being used.
Now, there are some words in this story that I would really like us to learn because we could use them all of the time. And this word is, let's read it by parts. The first part is con. What part, everyone? Con, and use the sound s. And the next part is sen. And the last part is trait. And say it really fast, everyone. Concentrate. One more time, everyone. Concentrate. One more time. Concentrate. Now, you remember in the story that some of the animals couldn't, what, everyone? Concentrate when the wolf was reading. Now, the word concentrate means that you are able to really think about something. You're able to put all of your attention on it. So when I really think about something and put all of my attention on it, I concentrate. What do, everyone? I concentrate. For example, if you were doing your math and you did one problem and then the next problem, and never looked up when someone came in the room, we would say that she knows how to, what, everyone? Concentrate. If you came to the library and sat down and you took out a book and you just read and read, even though he came over and she walked around you, we'd say, boy, you are able to put your thinking on it. You're able to put your attention on it. She knows how to, what, everyone? Concentrate. Get ready to tell me if this person in the pretend story knows how to concentrate. So you are reading in class and you just read and you turn the page and you read some more and you read some more and you read some more and you just keep reading. Does she know how to concentrate? Yes or no, everyone? Yes, okay? And this is pretend because it would never happen. So you start reading a page and then you look up at the clock and then you look down and then you talk over with your friends and you look back at the book. Does she know how to concentrate? Yes or no? She really does. That was just a pretend story. So once again, what is our word, everyone? Concentrate. Well, let's look at our next word. And the first part, everyone, is next one is press. And the whole word is impressed. So you are impressed with something when you think something is really good or someone is really good. Now you remember in the story at the beginning, they were not impressed with Wolf's reading. When I think something is really good, or I think someone is really good, I am what, everyone? Impressed. I'm what, everyone? Impressed. So, for example, if you turned in a story and it had a title and a main character and a problem and told me what happened in the beginning, middle, and end, I'd say, oh, that is so good. I am what, everyone? Impressed. If you did all of your math problems and you had numbers that were really neat and I could read them all, I would say, oh, thank you. I am so impressed. Right. Now, let's just pretend here that we go off to your house and we go in your bedroom and each of us come out and we say, oh, I'm so impressed. I'm so impressed. I'm so impressed. Now pretend that we were really impressed. Put your thumb up, and as soon as you can think of why we might be impressed. Oh, I got an idea. Okay, so you're going to tell your partner why you're impressed, but you're going to start out by saying, I was impressed because. What are you going to say, everyone? I was impressed because. So first ones and twos. Tell your partner if we went to our bedroom and we said we were impressed, why would we be impressed? Go. Excellent. And your idea? That would be really. Maybe she had lots of toys. So say I was impressed because she had lots of toys. Can you say that? His turn. Go ahead. Say it. Excellent. Okay, looking up here. So, using I was impressed. So, tell me your sentence. I was impressed because the room was clean. And your sentence? I was impressed because she had a lot of toys. And right here. I started out, I was impressed. Okay, now we're talking about a room. I'm impressed that you know how to do math. That's excellent. But make it match the room. So we went to a room. Maybe she had lots of dolls. And you said, I am impressed because she had many dolls. Can you say that? Excellent job. Well, once again, this word is what, everyone? Impressed. I am very impressed with you. Last word is educated. What word, everyone? Educated. When we learn something, particularly how to read and write, we say that then we are what, everyone? Educated. So when we come to school here and we work on learning how to read and write, we become more what, everyone? Educated. But then when we go to third and fourth and fifth grade and we learn more and more and we get more and more knowledge, we become more what, everyone? Educated. And when you go to middle school, you're going to become more educated. When you go to high school, you're going to become more educated. When you go to college, you're going to become more educated. Excellent. Now, I'm going to tell you about one of these words. As soon as you know the word, put your thumb up. I'm thinking about a word that means that you've learned to read and write and maybe other kinds of knowledge. Put your thumb up when you know that word. And whisper to your partner the word I'm thinking about. Okay, so when you've learned to read and write, then we would say you are educated. I'm thinking of a word that means.
All right, you can see the general idea of this particular strategy. So take a minute to write down what you believe are some of the pros and cons. And then I want you to look at the second two questions and consider in which classroom would you learn best? And then which classroom do you think is the best fit for all learners? All right, if we were in class, I would have you discuss this with your table and then share out your answers and some of your thoughts. But I just want to summarize real quickly some of the techniques that you may have seen. In the first video, there really isn't a lot of technique going on as far as working with a particular student, but there are some techniques with questioning, and you can see some of the text that was on the screen about clarifying student thought processes and encouraging the student to revise. In the second video, we saw a lot of different techniques that, as you can tell, that was that was explicit instruction. Just a very small snippet of what explicit instruction looks like. It's a lot more than just that particular type of video. But within there, hopefully you saw lots of repetition. Hopefully you saw some active student responding, where the students were chorally responding and responding with their own answers. You can see that the teacher did some think alouds, which we'll talk a little bit about here in the future, and students were given many opportunities to respond, and they were given many opportunities to receive feedback, which is key to learning. So those were just some of the strategies and techniques that I saw within that second video. You're going to have a different list of pros and cons. Um, I don't know in which classroom you would learn best. I know that I would likely learn best in the second classroom where explicit instruction was being used, at least when I'm learning a new skill. I think that the first video that you saw with the inquiry-based learning is a great way to have students practice the skills that they already have down pretty solid. So both of them certainly have their place. But I know when I'm learning a new skill or practicing or just starting to become competent with a skill, explicit instruction would definitely work best for me. And as far as which classroom is a better fit for all learners, hopefully it's pretty clear that explicit instruction would generally be the answer to that. You could see that that particular student was really struggling with what was going on. He was just kind of floating. And as it turns out, he wasn't even exactly sure what the question was asking. He had a really hard time with some of the basic tool skills. When she asked him what 3/6 was, he struggled with it a bit. And then finally she said, "What is another fraction for 3/6?" And he said a half, and he wasn't even quite sure. He kind of looked at her. So that wouldn't necessarily be a bad strategy, but before you can do something like inquiry-based learning or problem-based learning, you have to be absolutely sure that all of the students have the necessary prerequisite skills to be successful in that particular lesson. So hopefully you had some time to consider what those meant to you. So in teaching, hopefully you know this by now, I believe we've talked a little bit about science, that teaching can be seen as a science. There is a science to teaching. So we need to look at the research. It's important, especially in special education, but even it's growing in gen ed, where you have to be using evidence-based practices. And how do we know if something is an evidence-based practice? We know because it's been researched and the data tells us that the evidence supports its use. All right, so with explicit instruction, it's important that I show you where it's coming from. I'm sure you all trust me that explicit instruction is an evidence-based practice, but just in case, I want to show you just the beginnings of the research. So back in the day, a long time ago in the 70s, there was something called Project Follow-Through, which was the largest educational evaluation ever conducted, and millions of dollars was put into this particular project. And I would venture to guess that none of you have ever heard of Project Follow-Through, which is sad considering the government did this project with the whole point of finding out what is the best type of instructional program so that they can move forward and make sure all schools are using it. And so if you've never heard of it, then likely the results of this particular research project aren't being met or isn't being included in a lot of schools. All right, so what they did was they took a look at 3 types of programs. They looked at many different programs, but they lumped them into these 3 types. So some of them fit into what was called the basic skills model, and this is where they emphasize teaching basic academic skills to a fluent level. And then this is where a lot of the behavior analytic programs would fit. So this is where direct instruction, explicit instruction would fit. And then they had programs that fit into the cognitive conceptual realm. And this is where students were asked to focus on things like problem solving, learning to learn. So a lot like that first video you just watched with the inquiry-based learning. And then finally, they looked at programs that emphasize self-esteem, self-concept, and all about just building up students and making them feel good about themselves. And so this shows you each of the programs down the left where you see direct instruction, parent education, behavior reinforcement, language development. Those are all of the programs that they looked at. Right, so of those 3 categories that we see here, all of these programs fit into one of these 3 categories. And so what we see here, if we can look down at to the bottom of the screen here where it says academic, cognitive, and affective. So academic means they measured gains with academic skills. They measured cognitive, so this is all about the inquiry-based thinking. So they looked at the data in each program, how did they increase this particular skill. And then finally they looked at the affective, which is the emotional part, the self-concept. And so this center line here would represent zero growth with each of these programs in these three areas. Anything to the right shows that students made large gains in that particular area, and anything to the left shows that students did not keep pace with the learning that they should have been done. So all of these programs were far less effective than these programs. And these three here were only highly successful in the affective area, which is the emotional part. All great, but we go to school, yes, for the emotional growth, but we also go to school for the cognitive growth and the academic growth. And so the only program that showed large gains in all three areas was direct instruction, which is a very highly structured, scripted program. However, it is a basic skills model and uses tons of explicit instruction. So what we see is that this particular program is what should be used in schools. So you're asking yourselves, so great, I'm sure they use this all the time. Why don't I have a lot of experience with direct instruction? Because what we find is a lot of teachers hesitate to use direct instruction because it's scripted. So many teachers shy away from it, therefore many unions are against it, therefore schools just don't use it. All right. But the research does strongly suggest, as you can see by this red box, that explicit instruction, basic skills models are by far the most effective. So you do have research on your side when you use explicit instruction. So why does this matter? First is because if you are an intervention specialist major, that's what our program is based on. So in your methods classes, that's where you'll be focusing. When you go in and you teach your students, that's what I'll be looking for when I'm observing you. Additionally, EdTPA, they don't ever say we're looking for explicit instruction format or direct instruction format, but when you look at their rubrics, they lay it out in a way that shows that's exactly what they're looking for. Additionally, children with exceptionalities need the highest quality instruction. They are very far behind. So we can't waste time trying new things out with them. We have to use what we know works, which is explicit instruction. And finally, we are in this accountability stage in education. That's why it's all about data. That's why it's all about testing at this point, because the goal is to make teachers accountable for their students' learning. And the way that they ensure that's happening is that you're using evidence-based practices. And I just showed you, and there's tons more research out there, I promise, that says that explicit instruction is evidence-based. So what is explicit instruction? If somebody asks you what technique you'll use with your students, you'll hopefully say explicit instruction or direct instruction. And someone might say to you, what is that? And so the rest of these slides are going to kind of tell you what it is by definition and then show you the format and what it should look like. So if I ask you for the definition, I would be wanting you to say something about how it's direct teaching, which means led by the teacher, and that it's systematic, that it's very carefully planned. It is based on behaviorism. And we talked about applied behavior analysis, we've talked about behaviorism, and the one word you need to remember with behaviorism is environment. So behaviorism is all about the relationship between what your students are doing and the environment around them, what comes directly before the behavior and what comes directly after. That's the environment. So direct. I said before that direct means it comes from the teacher. The teacher is using clear and concise language. The point is not to confuse students. The point is not to use beautiful, flowery language. The point is to get students exactly what they need to know. One of the most major components of direct instruction and explicit instruction is errorless learning, meaning you're guiding students from the point of not knowing something to the point of mastering it with your guidance. You never release them to do something independently until you're sure they're going to get it right, because you're giving them lots of practice with lots of prompting. Systematic means you have already clearly identified the skills that you want your students to learn, and you have thought about all of the skills that go into that. And you task analyze is another word for it. Hopefully you're familiar with task analysis. In my methods classes, we'll talk much more about task analysis, but feel free to look it up if you're not familiar with it. It's just all about taking a skill you want students to learn and breaking it down into all of its smaller component skills and teaching them one by one. Right. Hopefully you remember talking about the three-term contingency, which is antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And so the way that explicit instruction plays into exploring your environment or manipulating your environment is that explicit instruction is an antecedent to any desired behaviors. And additionally, you are the teacher, so you are the antecedent to any of the desirable behaviors. One of the things I want you to just ask yourself, feel free to pause and answer this. When you sit down to write a lesson plan, where do you start? What's the first thing you plan? So if I tell you, okay, I want you to go and write a lesson plan right now in any subject that you want, right? What is the first thing that you would consider before you wrote out your plan? Many people answer this with talking about the activity that they're going to do. Okay, what am I going to do today for my lesson plan? Oh, we're going to play Jeopardy, right? So you never want to start with what the activity is because you're not working towards something, right? The first thing you always want to do is choose the standard and the IEP objectives. So you need to take a look at the Common Core standard or the academic standard and determine what it is you're going to be working towards. And then when you have students with IEPs, you have to also take a look at their IEP objectives and see how it fits into each of your lessons. Once you choose what you're going to be working towards, you then need to write the objective for that lesson. So I know the topic I'm going to cover, but what do I want my students to be able to do by the end of this lesson? And that then defines for you what am I going to do during the lesson to meet that goal at the end. So number 3 is planning your post-assessment. And hopefully you remember when we were working on writing IEP objectives, that there are 4 parts of an IEP objective, and those are the exact same objectives for lessons. If you remember, it starts out given an exit slip, the students will be able to correctly solve 4 single-digit addition problems with 100% accuracy. So within that objective, that tells me my assessment is right there. So I write number 2, I'm writing my lesson objective that I just said. And number 3, it tells me already. So what's my assessment? My assessment is going to be that exit slip, right? So those are the most important things you can do before you actually sit down and script out what you're going to be doing within your lesson. Make sure you're determining what standards you're going to be working towards, determine what your lesson objective is, and what they should be able to do by the end of the lesson. That then guides everything you do instructionally. This is just an example of a lesson objective. And so what is the post-assessment here? The post-assessment here is that exit slip. So at the end of the lesson, they should be able to do this. Hopefully everyone will be familiar, if they aren't already, with the Common Core standards or with academic standards. Common Core is for math and ELA. And then for science and social studies, there are academic content standards on the ODE website. Additionally, you should think about that some schools have their own standards. When I was at Worthington, we had to worry about the content standards that the state provides with, and we also had standards that Worthington schools asked us to meet. So we had to always be making sure we're meeting all of those. All right, now this is what is the explicit lesson format. So this is what I will most often ask you to tell me. This is what your lesson plan, that body of your lesson plan should look like. Within my methods courses, this is how it should be formatted. EdTPA, this is a perfect format for EdTPA. The way I tend to think about it is if I ask you what are the 3 main parts to an explicit lesson, it's the opening, the body, and the closing. Right? And that's just like a formal letter you probably learned how to write in 5th or 6th grade. And then the body has 3 parts: model, lead, test. And we're going to talk about each of these and what each of these should look like. So the first part is the opening or the introduction. And when you're introducing a lesson, you always start by gaining attention. You don't just get up and start talking. If you get up and start talking, some students might not be focused yet. You're going to have to repeat yourself. Some students aren't going to hear. And some students may learn to just keep talking over you because you haven't made them stop and listen. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is gain their attention. It helps to have a consistent signal for each lesson. It can be something, I'm sure you had this happen, the flicking of the lights and signaling students it's time to pay attention. Some people have some chants, like I've seen some of the high school teachers say OH, the students say IO, and then the lesson begins. Right? So there are lots of different things like that. And then you tell students the goal of that lesson. Tell students exactly what they'll be doing today so they have a clear understanding of where their focus needs to be. I always recommend going over the agenda. I know just from being a professor that I know my college students really love knowing exactly what we're doing that day. So you can see how high school students, middle school students, elementary school students would greatly appreciate that too. You also want to, as much as you can, tell them the relevance of learning that skill. Like when I presented to you all about IEP objectives, and I let you know that the relevance of it is it's going to help you to write legal IEP objectives, but even if you're not going to be writing IEPs, it's relevant to everyone because it's a good format for lesson plan objectives for EdTPA. So always try to show students where they're going to use that skill or how they're going to use it. When possible, connect to previous and future learning. It just gives students an idea that they're coming from a very specific place and heading to a very specific place. The last part of the opening, and it's probably the most important, is reviewing prerequisite skills. So when you decide what it is you're going to be teaching your students, you need to consider what are the skills they need to have in order to be successful in this lesson today. Right? If you don't review the prerequisite skills, what you may run into, you may try to teach students something new and realize that they don't even know how to do the basic skills to be successful in your lesson that day. And then you have to go back and review those skills. Right? So always make sure you're reviewing any prerequisite skills. Right? Most good lessons will review what you did the day before, just to make sure it's fresh for students. Make sure you understand that a review is not reteaching. It's only a very short review. You also don't want to say to students, do you remember how to add single-digit math facts? Right? So what are students going to say? Oh yeah, we remember. Right? You need to have proof that they have these prerequisite skills. So give them practice problems. Give them a problem and ask them to write the answer on the whiteboard. Right? So don't just ask them, do you remember? You also don't just want to ask a few students to come to the board or ask a few students to answer the prerequisite questions. Because generally when you ask a question, who raises their hand? The students that know the answer. The students that you know the answer. And the students that likely don't know the answer or that are going to be struggling aren't going to raise their hand. So you have to find a way to review prerequisite skills with all of the students. And so next week we're going to talk about active student responding. And ASR techniques are a wonderful way to make sure that all students know the prerequisite skills. All right, so I wanted to just show you what an opening example would look like. I will show you a scripted lesson where I gain attention, go over the objective, establish relevance, and review prerequisite skills. In my methods courses, if you are a special ed major, you'll have to write a scripted lesson plan where it looks like a play, and that's what I'm going to show you. When you see the T, it represents what the teacher will say, the teacher's script, and then when you see class, that's what the students will be expected to say. I won't read this to you, you can go ahead and read it. So pause as you need. All right, we're going to review throughout just to make sure you're getting the main points of what explicit instruction is because it is so important. So what is the first part of an explicit lesson plan? That's the introduction or the opening, which is what we just talked about. What are the elements that make up the introduction or the opening? Gaining attention, stating the objectives, connecting to previous learning, establishing relevance, and reviewing prerequisite skills are some of the elements. So we've talked about the opening. Now we're going to move on to talking about the body of an explicit instruction lesson plan. So when we talk about the body, it's made up of model lead test, also called I do it, we do it, you do it. In the model phase, the teacher demonstrates the skill or tells students exactly what they need to know. In the lead phase, this is often called guided practice. This is where the teacher and the students are working together on the skill. And then the test phase is where students are allowed to take their first stab at unprompted practice, all independent work. This is where you find out, did I model well? Did I do the guided practice well? Are my students able to do it by themselves? All right, so this is a model phase. Typically, the model phase begins by demonstrating the skill and telling students exactly what you are doing. The most common strategy used here is the think aloud, where you're thinking through the process for the students. There's a lot that goes on in your head as you're performing a skill or as you're learning, and students don't have access to that. Right, so you have to, it feels unnatural a lot, but you have to really think through the process out loud with them. So, for example, if you're teaching a comprehension strategy, you have to tell them what should be going on in their head, right? So if you're teaching students to check for understanding, to summarize, to restate, you would say to them, I read the paragraph, and then you would say, what did I read? Let me try to summarize that. Okay, first he was heading to school and realized he lost his backpack. Or did he lose it? Or did he just forget it? Okay, that tells me I'm not real sure. I'm going to have to go back and reread that part. Right, so that's exactly what you would be saying out loud to students, telling them the thought process in your head and showing them the strategy that's going on inside your head. That's what a think aloud is. And if it's a math problem, it may be something as simple as saying, okay, I have to add 100 plus 62. Right. First thing I'm going to write is 100 because it's the larger number. Right. Then I'm going to put 62 below it. I have to make sure that's lined up. The tens column and the ones column is lined up with the zeros in the number 100. Right. So that's just giving them access to all of those things. So think aloud can be one of the best strategies you can use, especially in the model phase. So good models do three things. They're clear, they're consistent, and they're concise. They use only important words. You don't use too flowery a language and you can lose students, especially students who struggle with vocabulary. If you start using a lot of big vocabulary words, they're going to get lost. Right? Always select familiar, consistent vocabulary. So this is a non-example. This is a bad example of how you can throw way too many words in here and confuse your students. You can push pause to read it. And this is a better example. This is telling students the exact same thing, but with much more clear, consistent, concise language. All right, so good models are clear, consistent, and concise, and good models do several demonstrations. If you're teaching students a skill, you can't just show them once and then say, okay, now you try it, right? So I know some of you are not athletes, and so if I was trying to teach you how to shoot a layup, I wouldn't model once, just shoot a layup real quick and say, okay, you do it. That wouldn't be enough. I need to model slowly, show you each step, break it down, show you over and over again, give you a technique to remember, some sort of mnemonic device so that you can remember all the steps you need to take. Right? So modeling there's a lot involved in modeling. You need to make sure you do plenty of models. But you also don't want to overdo it. You need to gauge your students. You need to see when they start to lose interest, then you may have done too many models. If you overdo it, then you're going to lose a lot of your students. And the more you model, the more students aren't doing it themselves, and you want to get them involved. One of the things that I think is pretty vital when you're showing students examples and doing demonstrations is you take time to show students non-examples or how they can go wrong. Right? So sometimes in order to understand what something is, we have to understand what something is not. Right, so for example, if you remember the explicit instruction video with Anita Archer when she was doing the vocabulary, she asked students to show them and talked about what it means to practice and what happens if you don't practice, right? What happens when you, what it looks like to concentrate and what it looks like to not concentrate, right? So we can better understand what concentration is when we can see what it isn't, right? So some ways you can do that, if you're teaching students math and how to, maybe you have to line up, like I had mentioned before, you have to correctly line up the numbers in the right place value. Right? So show them what happens if you don't line it up correctly and you get the wrong answers. That's a non-example. If you're teaching students proper nouns and how to capitalize proper nouns, you show them words like um, Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and then show them the word city. Right? That could be a non-example. Right? It's not specific enough, so we don't capitalize it. Right? So make sure you're showing students what something looks like and what something doesn't look like. And finally, good models are clear, consistent, concise. Good models do just enough demonstrations, and good models involve students as much as you can. Right? So you model the first time, and then you start to ask students questions about the first time you modeled to see what they paid attention to. Make sure you're having them think about what it is that you're modeling. Right? So some of the ways you can go wrong in the modeling phase is you only give one example. You forget to include students and you're just up there modeling and talking away and you're not sure if they're paying attention. One of the big mistakes people make are asking a question about the lesson before it is taught. So if you're going to be teaching students proper nouns, then don't say, can anybody name a proper noun? You, hopefully you've pre-assessed and you know they can't do it. That's why you're teaching the lesson. If they can answer that question, then there's no point in teaching the lesson. So make sure you don't ask students something that you haven't taught them. Right? Another error that can often be made is not modeling each type. I know this happened to me a lot in algebra in high school. We would do practice problems together, and I'd be like, oh, I got it. And then he'd hand us the homework, and I'd get 3 problems in, and it would be just a slightly different variation of what he showed us, but he never showed us how to do that type. All right. So whatever you're going to expect them to do, look at your post-assessment. Any of those problems or those that knowledge you're going to expect them to have, at some point you have to give that information to them in the modeling phase. Right? So make sure you're task analyzing every step that you're asking them to know. So some take-home points about modeling. The goal is to show or tell students exactly what they should know. They shouldn't have to guess. They shouldn't have to find information on their own. If you want them to know something, you have to tell them or show them. Right? Make sure you don't expect students to know something you haven't showed them or told them. Be sure to show both examples and non-examples and show them every possible variation of the skill. So that's the model phase. And what we need to make sure is we don't move past the modeling phase until we feel students are ready. When we feel students are ready, we can then start to have them be more involved. So the lead phase, also called prompted or guided practice. This is where students are able to slowly try something out with your guidance. So if we're talking about the basketball example, the lead phase would be, the model phase would be, I'm showing you how to do a layup. We're talking through the process. You're telling me what the steps are. And then once I feel you have that, then we're going to do it together. Then you're going to stand beside me and we're going to take the steps together and we are going to jump off of the same foot together, just slowly, slowly, so that if you make mistakes, I can immediately give you feedback so that you don't continue to make those mistakes. So think of it that way. You're always making sure the students are getting the right answer in this phase. Provide any prompts that you can, right? So you can give them directions before they do it, give them cues, give them any reminders they might need, give them some clues, right? So if it's a math problem, maybe you can give them a list of steps that they need to take to solve that written down, and they just use that, those numbers 1 through 3. The first thing I need to do is line them up correctly. The second thing I do is start adding at the ones column. Then I go to the next column over, the tens column. So it's okay to give them those cues and clues here. You want to make sure they're getting it right. That's where the errorless learning comes in. Students should never be making errors because you're giving them prompts and prompts. Eventually you'll fade that out, but for now they have to practice it correctly over and over and over again. You can use physical prompts, you can use vocal prompts, and you can use visual prompts. Any type of prompting that is appropriate for that skill and for that student's ability level. With prompting, one of the most dangerous things that can happen is that students become prompt dependent, meaning that they can't perform the skill without your prompt. So you always want to start to fade your level of prompting until you don't need them at all. So if students make an incorrect response, it's okay to add those prompts back in. So you remove a prompt, students make a mistake, you put it back in for the next 2-3 tries so that they can get it right. As much as you can, you want to be sure to ask students questions to find out what's going on in their head so that you can see what their thought process is so you can make corrections if you need to. It also helps them to make deep connections with what it is they're learning. It's important here in this phase that you're monitoring the responses and immediately correcting any errors. It may be possible that if students start to make errors here in the lead phase, that you take a step backwards and model a few more for them. Some of the bad things you can do in the lead phase is not doing enough models, and then you move on to this step before students are ready. So if students are making errors here, then you did not do the modeling phase effectively, and students can easily get frustrated. So the take-home points with the We Do It. Allow students to practice the skill with your immediate feedback. Do not let them practice errors here. Prompting is a very good thing. If you're leading them to the answer, that's okay. That's what you should be doing here. And then you want to slowly fade those prompts out. Before you can move on to the test phase, you have to be 99.9% sure that they're ready and they're going to get it right. And then the test phase. Test phase is where you're providing unprompted practice, giving students each a chance to do something independently. In the independent practice phase, this is their initial first-time attempt at independent practice. But this is still done under your supervision. This is not where you hand them a worksheet and say, okay, you try it. You instead give them one problem, ask them one question, so you can be sure they're all getting it right on their own. When mastery is met, so when you determine that they've done enough unprompted practice, then you can move on to closing the lesson and giving them the assessment. When we look at model lead test, it doesn't have to be just in one lesson. So one lesson plan may have model lead test, or if it's a more complex skill, you might be modeling that skill over a couple days and then doing a couple leads for the next 2 days and then not even moving on to the test phase till the last day of the week, right? But it may be lots of model lead tests within your lesson. So this can look a lot of different ways, but everything you teach should follow this format. So some take-home points with the test is that students should be practicing getting the correct answer repeatedly. Students should be making very few errors, if any. Right? So if students are making errors in the test phase, then you go backwards. You go back into the lead phase, sometimes back into the model phase. So there's an error correction procedure built into model lead test. Students will maintain skills that they repeat often. Therefore, there's no reason to feel guilty about having students practice the skills over and over and over again, because it's more likely they're going to maintain that skill much later. But just be aware this is not the assessment phase. This is not where you hand them the exit slip. This is still under your direct supervision. One of the things you want to be careful too is not doing the test phase with partners. The danger in that is that you might have, within a pair, you might have one student who really gets it and one who doesn't. But if they're only producing one answer as a pair, then you would never know that. So make sure in this phase you're individually checking all students. Then we have the closing. The closing of a lesson should be very brief. It should begin with a short review of what was learned. So just ask students, okay, what was the first thing that we learned how to do? What was the second thing? What do we need to remember about that? Right, so a short review. And then I always like to give a short preview of what we're going to do tomorrow and how it links to what we did today. If you can. This is a great time to assign independent work to give students more practice. One of the things I'm not about is giving homework for something you taught that day unless you are absolutely sure they're all going to do well. Very often what happens is you send kids home with homework about something you taught that day that they don't quite get yet, and then they're going to go home and practice errors. All right, so only give independent work or homework if you know students have really mastered that skill. If you want to give them homework every day, that's fine. But what you may do is give them homework that's a review of something you did earlier in the year or something you did last week that you already know they've mastered. All right, I wanted to show you an example of explicit instruction because I feel like I've talked about it, but you really need to see it in action. So I'm going to show you a video of what it should look like, and hopefully you can start to identify the opening, the model, the lead, the test, and the closing of the lessons. So just try to pay attention to the video and identify those items.
All is quiet in Stacy Jones' 6th grade math class, though much is happening here. Her students, most of them avid self-starters, have learned how to use the first few minutes of class to focus on their assignments, and they know this time to prepare and catch up is brief.
2 minutes till we correct.
The tactic, allowing self-starters to get ahead and time for Mrs. Jones to quietly help those with questions, is a key element in a teaching practice known as explicit instruction. Achieving such efficiency and discipline in the classroom requires consistency from the teacher as well. These students tend to be focused because they know what is expected from them for each lesson. Instruction begins with a class recitation of the content and language objectives for the day.
Be able to identify angles as vertical, adjacent, complementary, supplementary, and provide descriptions of each.
Next, Mrs. Jones does what all teachers do.
Put everything else away.
She tells students the information they need to achieve the class objectives.
Eyes up here. Let's try it. 2x, and then we added 4.
And in the teaching, she is careful to keep students engaged.
Plus 4 is? It works for that one. Let's try this one. 3 times 2 is? 6. Plus 4 is? That one works. The difference between telling and lecturing is I tell them what I expect them to know, and I want them to repeat it back to me. I tell them what we're going to do during the day, and they repeat it back to me. I have them finish my sentences so I know they're listening and understanding. I want them to repeat as a whole class so that even if they don't know, they can hear what the answer is.
Modeling, or carefully showing students how to work an assignment, is the core of instruction.
Together.
Teaching
Can I count
is
by
more
2
than
until
talking.
10? What do we need to find? Our denominators are 10 and 2.
The next step is to encourage students to move from mimicking to thinking, providing their own answers, perhaps with a little coaching.
Are 10 and 2 both prime? No, so we can't multiply them together. Can I count by 2 and say 10?
Yes.
Yes, so what is my denominator going to be? 10.
Rote responses may help memorization, but application can be internalized by kinesthetic feedback. Stacy prompts the students to use their limbs to demonstrate geometry principles.
Okay, I need you to stand up, push your chair in, and face me. Can you see how that's a 90-degree angle? Straight arm down, straight arm across. Show me 90 degrees with your arms. Straight arms. Straight up by your ear, straight up to the side. 90 degrees. What would we call this angle if we had 2 angles that equal 90 degrees? What do we call them? Complementary angles. Okay, if I was going to make a straight line with my arms would be out like this. What does a straight line equal? 180 degrees. If I have 2 angles on a straight line, what is that called?
Supplementary.
Correct. Okay, show me 90 degrees. Two angles that make up 90-degree angle are called what?
Complementary angles.
Show me a straight angle. Two angles that make up a straight angle are called what?
Supplementary angles.
Correct.
Stacy has also found that a simple technology such as a whiteboard can encourage struggling students to try.
The whiteboard seems to be less intimidating for just paper and pencil. They seem to be able to write down what they know, and then they know they can erase it if it's incorrect. So they tend to put down what they think is correct, and then they can learn if they're wrong, and they can try again the next time. And 3, 2, 1, and show me. It looks like almost everyone has the correct answer.
In addition to whole class participation, smaller group work can help each student.
The advantage of working in groups is for children to learn from each other, where they can tell the group what they know, and maybe they know something different than someone else in their group, and they can add it to their problem solving. If a student can offer their information, what they know that maybe someone else doesn't, it boosts their self-esteem, makes them feel good about themselves, and that they can accomplish things in math.
Sooner than later, students must be allowed to produce their own answers. It is while they work on their assignments in class privately that the teacher can see what they know.
Independent practice is for me to know what they're understanding, how the class is doing, what we need to go over again, and the positive things that have come out of our lesson. So I have the students usually work on a worksheet, a review practice, while I'm helping a small group up in the front. I rotate the groups so that I can individually help the students and see what level they're at and what they're having a hard time with. The end product of explicit teaching is that the students enjoy math. They get to contribute what they know. They know what they're expected of for the lesson. They know the objectives. They'll see the same vocabulary words on testing. They know the vocabulary words. They've heard them, they've seen them, they've written them, they've said them. They feel confident in themselves. They feel like they can accomplish things in math. And they come away learning more because they're more confident.
So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what explicit instruction looks like beyond just the words that I've shared with you. Okay, what follows next is just a list of questions that for you to review this lesson. So you can pause after each question and take a guess, and then the answer will be revealed to you.